Okay, so the next thing that we will discuss are what we call scalar components. Okay, so suppose you have this vector here. Tapos let's call this vector R. Now, yung scalar components ng vector na ito would be the projection ng vector natin along a specific axis. So, ano ibig sabihin ng projection? So, if we put yung ating vector, lalagay natin yung tail niya dun sa origin ng ating coordinate system, that will be this axis here, then its scalar components will be yung values if you project yung vector natin sa x or sa y-axis. So, ano ibig sabihin nun? If you project itong vector natin sa x-axis, then you will see a value at this point, value ng x at this point. So, we can call that R sub x. That would be what we call the x component ng ating vector R. Now, likewise, you can do the same sa y-axis. I-project mo yung vector sa y-axis. And then, merong value yung y at this point here. That will be your R sub y. Or, you could also say na yung scalar components ng vectors will be yung coordinates nung head ng ating vector. Pinilagay natin yung tail ng vector sa axis. Ang coordinates nitong head will be yung kanyang scalar component. So, for this particular example, yung coordinates itong head would be R sub x, R sub y. So, yan yung magiging coordinates niya. Ang coordinates ng ating vector will be your x component and y component. So, that's one way of thinking about scalar components ng ating vector. Now, the notation that we will use, as you have seen dun sa nilagay natin sa taas, so we will use the same symbol ng ating vector. In this particular case, that will be R. Tapos, maglalagay tayo ng subscripts to indicate yung component. So, first, R sub x. Tapos, yung isang component natin is R sub y. Again, we use a subscript, itong subscripts na ito, to indicate na these are components. Now, last time, we've seen na kapag yung symbol lang, let's say R lang ang ginawa mo, this only means magnitude. Now, ang unique thing about magnitude, hindi siya pwede maging negative kasi this is particularly, yan yung length ng ating vector. Bawal siya maging negative. Pero, ang ating vector components can be negative or positive. So, to give an example, let's look at this vector here. Okay, so let's take this vector S. Okay, itong vector S. If we get yung kanyang y component, then i-project lang natin siya. Yung galing sa kanyang head, i-project natin papunta sa y-axis. Tapos yung value ng y dito will be your y component ng vector S. Now this component here, since nandito siya sa positive y na axis, this will take a positive na value. So, kung i-solve natin yan later, dapat positive yung makuha natin na value dito. However, if you project vector S doon sa ating x-axis, tapos you'll get a value for x here. So, that will be your x component. Now, since itong x component na ito is found in the negative x-axis, diba? Ito yung positive ng x-axis, so nasa negative na ito. Then, your x component will take a negative value. Okay? So, pag sinolve natin mamaya yung s sub x, tapos nandito siya nakalagay, dapat negative yung makuha natin na value. So, again, scalar components can be negative or positive. Now, let's try looking at some examples na ma-apply natin ito. Let's look at the simplest case. What if yung ating vectors are along the axis? So, let's look at this example. So, let's look at these four vectors here. So, meron tayong vector L, itong upward na vector. So, you have vector M, papunta sa right. N is papunta sa left. And O, which is pababa. Ito yung simplest case. For all these vectors, they are along yung ating axis. This will be the x-axis. This will be y-axis. Tapos nakalagay sila doon sa x and y-axis. So for this particular example, madali lang mahanap yung ating components. We simply go doon sa head ng ating vectors. By the way, before doing this method, make sure na yung tail ng ating vector is nandito sa origin ng axis. No, so this will not work if nandito yung vector natin. Dapat andito yung tail sa origin. Okay, so once you did that, then we will simply project. I-project lang natin siya along each axis. Now, ito yung head ng vector L. If you project it along the x-axis, you end up at which value? You end up at the origin. No? Ito yung origin. So, the x value at the origin is 0. So, in this particular case, if i-project mo siya, so you will have at x equals 0, yan yung x component ng ating vector L. Okay? Did you see that? No? You start sa head, project mo siya sa ilalim, so you'll end up at the origin, which is x equals 0. Now, for the y component, start ka dito, project mo siya sa y-axis, so dito siya mag-end. Basically, let me draw. Basically, at this point here, no? Kung anong value ng y at this point. Now, since this is the positive y-axis, and we are told na yung length ng ating vector is 15 centimeters, so actually, if you project it here, you'll end at y equals 15 centimeters. Okay? Kasi doon din nakapatong yung head ng ating vector. So that is, our y component is 15 centimeters. Okay? So madali lang. Madali lang for these kinds of vectors na along sila sa axis. Now, we can do the same for m. Okay? Project mo siya sa x-axis. So, nandito siya. Nandito yung ating m sub x. And we are told na yung length nito is 20 centimeters. So, this would be 20 din. No? At this point, ang value ng x mo is 20. So, we can write m sub x is equal to 20 centimeters. Okay? Now, for the y-axis, we simply project yung head ng ating vector m. Project mo sa y-axis. And then you arrive at the origin. No? So, at the origin, y equals 0. So, ang m sub y natin, or y component ng vector m, is 0. Okay, so madali lang, di ba? Let's go to vector n. Okay, so here is your head. Project mo siya along the x-axis. So, you'll end here. Okay, dyan yung projection ng ating n. And then we are told na ang length nito is 12 centimeters. However, this time, nandito na tayo sa negative x. No? Negative x na ito siya. So, if this is 12 centimeters long from the origin, tapos nasa negative ka na side, this should be equal to negative 12 centimeters. Okay? So, yung x component ng ating n sub x should be negative 12 centimeters. Okay? Now, ang y component niya, again, project it sa y-axis. Nandito yung head ng ating n. Pag project mo sa y-axis, you also end up sa origin, which is y equals 0. So, n sub y is equal to 0. Now, finally, let's look at vector O. Vector O is here. Project natin sa x-axis. Ito yung x-axis, no? Project natin siya. So, you end up at the origin. At the origin, you also have x equals 0. So, ang value nito, O sub x, should be 0. Tapos, O sub y would be yung projection ng ating vector along the y-axis. So, you end up here. Ito yung projection niya, O sub y. We are told na yung length ng vector na yon is 10 centimeters. No? 10 centimeters na yung length na ito. Okay? So, we have 10 centimeters from the origin, pero papunta sa negative side. So, your y component should be negative 10 centimeters. Okay. So, ganito lang kasimple ang paghanap ng scalar components ng vectors that are along our axis. Now, one observation here, lahat ng values na meron tayo, 15 centimeters, 20 cm, 12 cm, 10 cm, lahat yun ay magnitude ng ating vectors. Such that we can rewrite actually yung answers natin. So, L sub x, we already know na 0 siya. Pero L sub y is equal to its magnitude L. Diba? Kasi 15 centimeters is equal to the magnitude L. Okay? Likewise, you can do that for n. N, x is negative nung kanyang magnitude. no? So, ginawa lang nating negative. Tapos, ang magnitude niya is 12 centimeters. Pero kasi nasa negative siya, so nilagyan natin ng negative. Tapos, ang kanyang y component is 0. Okay, so you can do that for M and for O. You can see na kapag ang vector is along the axis, no, nakalagay lang siya sa axis, then one of the components will be 0, tapos yung isa is magiging equal sa magnitude, positive or negative ng magnitude. Now, how about for vectors na hindi along the axis? What if may angle na yung ating vectors? Let's consider this vector here. Let's call this vector R. Tapos, let's say it has an angle of theta galing sa x-axis. Now, from our definition, yung ating x component and y component is simply the projection ng ating vector. So, let's simply project it here. Tapos, kung ano yung value ng x dito, that will be your x component, the value of x here. Tapos, for the y component, let's project it along the y-axis. Yung value ng y at this point here, that will be your r sub y. Or simply, that is equal to the coordinates ng ating head if our tail is placed doon sa origin. Okay, so how do we solve this? If ang alam lang natin is yung magnitude ng vector r, tapos alam natin itong angle na ito, how do we solve for the x component and y component? Now, if you remember your trigonometry, your vector actually forms a right triangle. Okay? So, meron kang right triangle na na-form dito. This angle here is 90 degrees. So, this will be a right triangle. And for a right triangle, meron tayong parts. We call these parts the hypotenuse. Yung hypotenuse mo would be the longest side ng right triangle. Ito yung pinakamahabang side ng right triangle. Now, one side is connected doon sa ating angle. So this will be the side that is connected sa angle. Ano ibig sabihin ng connected? If you see yung drawing natin sa angle, ganito siya, di ba? So the angle is connected sa hypotenuse at saka doon sa isang side which is connected sa angle. That's why we will call this side, ang tawag natin dito sa connected na side, we call it adjacent. No? Adjacent, magkadikit. No? Magkadikit doon sa ating angle. Which is in fact, nakadikit siya doon sa angle. So that will be the adjacent side. And then, we have yung side na hindi nakadikit sa angle natin. So, it will be this side here. No? So, this will be what we call the opposite na side. So, we can actually use itong adjacent side at saka opposite side to solve for the value of r sub x and r sub y. If you see, yung length na ito, that is equal doon sa opposite na side. Tapos, yung length ng ating adjacent na side, that will be yung length papunta doon sa ating r sub x. Now, from trigonometry, we have what we call the trigonometric functions. Or yung simply, ang ating mnemonic niyan would be SOHCAHTOA, where our sine nung angle natin, this angle here, na binigay sa atin, yung sine daw niyan, that is a trigonometric function, sine theta is equal to your opposite over the hypotenuse. Kaya tinawag siyang SO. Now, cosine theta is equal to your adjacent over your hypotenuse. Kaya tinawag natin siyang ka. And then finally, you have tangent theta is equal to opposite over adjacent. Kaya din tinawag na TOA. Now, to solve for r sub x and r sub y, we need to solve for A and for O. So how do we do that? How do we solve for adjacent and the opposite side? Let's start muna sa adjacent. Paano natin isolve yung adjacent? So galing sa cosine na equation, we said na cosine theta is equal to adjacent over the hypotenuse. So we can move around yung terms. So let's move around itong h. Punta natin dun sa kabilang side. So since division siya, magiging multiplication siya pagdating sa kabila. So you have h cosine theta, and that is equal to A. Now, for this particular example, ang A natin will be equal to your r sub x. Now, galing sa origin, you have a distance that is equal to A. Then, that would be equal to your r sub x. Another thing na pwede nating i-note dito, note na yung ating hypotenuse, h, that will be the length ng ating vector. Yun yung h. So, we can say that our h is equal sa magnitude ng ating vector because the length of this arrow here is equal dun sa magnitude ng ating vector. So we can put that there. So we can write yung x component ng ating vector would be r cosine theta. Okay? So we use yung trigonometric function na cosine in order to solve for the value of the x component. Now, how about the opposite side? How do we solve for the opposite side? No, which is equal lang sa distance ng ating component galing sa origin. So in this case, we will use sine. So that will be opposite over hypotenuse. Let's move around yung terms. So pwede natin ilipat yung hypotenuse dun sa kabilang side. So you'll have yung opposite side. Now for our particular example, yung opposite side is equal dun sa ating r sub y. Now, the distance from the origin papunta sa r sub y is equal to opposite, so they should have the same value. So, the opposite side will be equal to r sub y. Tapos, we said kanina na yung hypotenuse is equal to the magnitude of the vector r. So, this would look like r sub y is equal to r sine theta. So, ito yung value ng ating y component. So, na-solve na natin siya. However, what I want to caution everyone is that this is not always the case. Hindi palaging ang x component is cosine theta at hindi palaging ang y component is r sine theta. Now, to explain further, I'd like to show us a different example. So, consider this vector S here. Ito yung vector S. Now, nasa ibang location na yung ating angle. Andito na siya. So, if we get our projections, let's say, project natin sa y-axis, this will be the y component. So, project natin siya sa x-axis, this will be the x component. Now, nag-iba na yung parts ng ating triangle dito. Okay? So, this is still the hypotenuse. Equal pa rin siya sa magnitude ng ating vector. But the adjacent side here will be this side here. Ito na yung side na connected or adjacent sa ating angle. Diba? Andito yung angle. This will be the side that is adjacent to it. So, we'll put A here. So, itong length na ito, that will be your adjacent side. Tapos, this side here, this is now your opposite na side. So, what happens to our components? So, ang ating y component here is equal doon sa adjacent na side. Okay? Yung y component is equal na sa adjacent na side. So, S sub y will take yung adjacent na side. And if you go back doon sa equations natin kanina, the adjacent side is equal to h cosine theta. So, let's put that here. Adjacent side is h cosine theta. We already mentioned na yung h is equal doon sa magnitude ng ating vector. So, we can write here S sub y is equal to S cosine theta. Okay? So, you see, na for this particular case, hindi na sine ang y component. Ang y component will take yung cosine na value. How about the x component? X component is found here. Now, in order to solve for the x component, kailangan mo natin i-solve yung opposite side kasi this length here is equal to this length here. But this time, yung ating x component can be found on the negative x-axis. So, what do we do there? Okay? So, our s sub x is actually negative nung length na O. Kasi negative x-axis siya, pero it has the same length. Okay? So, what we've seen kanina is that our opposite side is equal to h sine theta. No? H sine theta yung opposite na side. So, we'll simply replace itong O with h sine theta. So, that would be negative h sine theta. Tapos, we already said na yung value ng h is equal doon sa magnitude ng s. No? Pareho sila dyan. So, we can replace h with s. So, s sub x is equal to negative the magnitude times sine theta. Okay? So for this particular example, nag-flip na sila, no? Ang s sub y mo na, ang cosine, tapos ang s sub x mo, ang sine. Tapos you need to also add yung negative dito kasi nasa negative x axis siya. So what will be our rule? How do we find the x component at saka y component ng vectors? So kanina, nakita natin na kapag along the axis siya, madali lang siyang i-solve. Pero if it is angled, we will use sines and cosine. So the way I like to teach it is in 2D, let's say you have a vector v. So you will have two components kung 2 dimensions lang siya. One of the components, I will call it the adjacent component. So that may be x or y, depende kung saan nakalagay yung angle mo. So that will take plus minus v cosine theta. Now, the other component, we will call it v opposite. So that will be plus minus v sine theta. Now, for the components ng angled na vectors, pareho lang yung form niya. You have the magnitude, tapos you either have cosine or sine, tapos you have the angle. Tapos you will also have positive or negative, depende kung saan pumunta yung projection natin. Sa positive x ba, or sa negative x, or sa positive y, or sa negative y. Now, kung gusto nyong matandaan ito, i-memorize siya kaagad, what I suggest that you memorize, if it is adjacent, we will use cosine. Now, adjacent simply means connected. So, if it is connected, then you use cosine. So, we use cosine if it is connected. No, so, yun doon yung term, no? Connected, cosine. Okay? So, kung hindi naman siya connected, we will use sine. Okay, this time, let's look at some examples of vectors. Tapos, we will try to solve for the x component and y component nung vectors na ito. Okay, let's look at this first vector here. So we have vector A, tapos ang kanyang magnitude is 11 inch. Now, it is pointing to the left. So kung mag-draw tayo ng axis dito, okay, what did we notice? It is on the negative x axis. Okay? So let's solve first yung kanyang x component. So a sub x would be, let's try to project galing doon sa head. Project natin sa x-axis. So, it will be located here. So, kung anong value ng x dito, that will be your a sub x. Now, since this length here is 11 inch, okay? Tapos nasa negative side siya. So, that will be simply negative tapos equal sa magnitude niya. Or, negative 11 inches. Okay? Ganun lang kadali. Now, for the y component ng vector A, we simply project it galing dito sa head, papunta sa y-axis, and you'll see na mag-end up siya dito sa origin. Which means, your a sub y is 0. Okay? Your a sub x is negative 11 inches, tapos your a sub y is 0. Okay? So, yan yung x component at saka y component ng vector A. Let's look at another vector. This is vector B. Tapos, let's say you have an angle here that is 56 degrees. The magnitude is 19 inches. Okay? So, let's solve first yung kanyang x component. So, let's project galing sa head, pupunta dun sa x-axis. So, your x component will be the value of x here. Now, we will use yung ating trigonometric function. First, we need to know if positive ba ito or negative. So, remember, ang ating v adjacent is plus minus v cosine theta. Tapos our opposite is plus minus v sine theta. Yun yung equation natin. Let's put this aside. Okay? So, is this positive or negative? Now, since yung ating projection falls on the positive x-axis, so this will take yung positive value. Next, we put yung kanyang magnitude. Magnitude ang next. So, let's simply put B. Tapos, we need to identify if this is adjacent or connected. If it is connected, we will use cosine. If not, we will use sine. So, here is your angle. Ito yung length na gusto nating hanapin. So clearly, they are not connected. No? Hindi siya nakadikit dito sa ating angle. So we will use sine. Kasi kung hindi connected, sine yung gagamitin natin. But if connected, we will use cosine. So now we simply substitute yung ating values. The magnitude ng ating vector is 19 inches. Tapos you have sine. As the angle is 56 degrees. Now let's simply use our calculator to solve it. Okay? So we have 19 times sine 56. Make sure your calculator is in degrees kasi merong setting na naka-radians siya. So meron ata kayong pwedeng pindutin para maging degrees yung pagkilala ng calculator nyo about the angles. So your answer should be, let's round this off to 3 significant figures. So your answer will be 15.8. So b sub x would be equal to 15.8. Now, yung ating sine 56 degrees and lahat ng ating trigonometric function, wala silang unit. So, ang lalabas dito na value is walang unit. So, ang only unit na meron tayo is yung unit ng magnitude, which is inches. So, i-carry over natin ito doon sa ating answer. So, 15.8 inches. Okay? So, that will be the x component. Now, for the y component, kailangan natin siya i-project again. Galing sa head ni B, papunta sa y-axis. So, this point here, anong value ng y dyan? Okay? Kung ano ang value ng y dito, that will be your b sub y. So, let's try to solve ano kayang equation na gagamitin natin dyan. So, b sub y, first we need to ask if it is positive or negative. So, if you look at kung saan nag-fall yung ating projection, nasa positive y-axis siya. So, this is positive. Tapos, let's put yung magnitude. So, that would be B. Then, we need to ask if it is adjacent or opposite. So, connected ba siya or not? Here is your angle. Ito yung gusto natin kunin na length para ma-solve yung B sub y. So, clearly, it is connected. So, we will use cosine. So, this will be B cosine theta. Let's substitute yung ating values. The magnitude is 19 inches. Tapos, the angle is 56 degrees. Okay? Tapos, plug in lang natin to sa calculator. So, that would be 19 times cosine of 56. Okay? So, you should be able to get 10.6. 10.6. Tapos again, walang unit ito. So, the only unit is from your magnitude. You carry over yung unit ng magnitude mo. Okay? So, this is the y component nung vector B. So, yeah, another example. Okay, let's look at this vector C. So, solve natin yung components niya. So, C sub x. So, first, let's determine if the x component is positive or negative. So, let's project. Galing sa head. Project natin sa x-axis. Whatever the value of this point here, that will be your c sub x. Now, since our c sub x falls on the negative x-axis, so we should take this time negative na yung value ng ating c sub x. Next, we put the magnitude c. Tapos, let's determine if the component is adjacent, connected, or not. So, here is your angle. Tapos, ito yung gusto natin isolve na component. So, clearly, it is connected. So, we will use cosine theta. Let's substitute yung values. So, C would be, hindi ko nalagay, that is 26 inch. So, the magnitude is 26 inches. Cosine, the angle is 33 degrees. Okay? Plug in natin sa calculator. Remember, this time, it is negative 26 times cosine 33 degrees. Getting 3 significant figures, that should be negative 21.8. So, this would be negative 21.8. Again, carrying over yung unit ng ating magnitude. So, that will be 21.8 inch. Okay, so this is your x component. So, for the y component, First, let's determine if it is positive or negative. So, project natin yung ating vector towards the y-axis. Now, if you notice, yung ating vector falls on the negative y-axis. No? Nasa negative y siya. So, this should also take a negative na value. Tapos next, let's determine if it is connected or not. Our angle is here. Yung gusto nating isolve is andito. So, clearly, hindi siya connected. No? Andito yung gusto nating isolve. Tapos, nandito yung ating angle. So, we will use sine. So, let's put yung magnitude first pala. Tapos, sine theta. Plugging in yung values, you have 26 inch. Tapos, your angle is 33 degrees. So, C sub y, if we plug this in sa ating calculator, negative 26 times sine 33 degrees. So, you should have 14.2. 14.2 inches. Okay, so this is now your y. Okay? So that's how you solve for the x component and y component of vectors.